COVID-19 silver lining. So looking at COVID as a catalyst for opening up the streets. And so I think that's the main theme, the overriding theme that we're looking at right now is opening up the streets. And within the context of what we're dealing with coronavirus, which are some of the opportunities on the upside, and there are so many downsides, but this is what it's all about, looking for some of those things that we could, those takeaways from this terrible, terrible experience. So, let's see, moving down, trying to get my, are you in control of this screen or am I? I think you are. So we move down one to the next.
You should be able to take control, Morty. Just wiggle your mouse or something.
Okay, all right. So maybe with the mouse I can do it. Oh, here, I use those arrows. All right. Okay, there we go. Okay, so in Cynthia's kind introduction of who I am, what I've been involved with, she is accurate that I am working now with Department of Interior, mainly focused on NEPA issues and environmental impact statements. But I'm also, as a corollary, involved with this consulting collaborative called Green Planning Collaborative. And the current, or the focus has been, the more recent focus, on sustainable transport, mainly micromobility and associated infrastructure. And I'm sure you know something about micromobility, and if not, what it pertains to as they emerge area, e-bikes and e-scooters, and also, which you might not realize, and a lot of people are not paying so much attention to, but what's probably coming around the next bend are the low-speed and neighborhood vehicles. And these were popular, the ideas at least in concept, many years ago, but the technology just wasn't there. And now that it's been advancing at an exponential rate, particularly because of the e-scooters, this is transferable over to these small, lightweight, low-speed neighborhood type vehicles. So anyway, that's one of my major side interests, and I was organizing a conference in Boise, and given with the situation with coronavirus, like a lot of other things, this is all deferred. But anyway, that's one of the main things that I've been involved with. Now, just to mention, and I'm gonna go down with my mouse again here to the, okay. So, okay, so this overriding theme we mentioned, we want to consider really, like most of you are giving a lot of thought to, where are we at right now and where are we headed? Can we envision a new normal? So I don't think anyone is interested in returning to the status quo, what was going on before and this is a great opportunity to open up our minds and envision some alternative futures that really embrace the different ideas that have been spinning around with regard to the other types of things that the street provides or can provide. There we go. So I included a few pictures here and there that just liven this presentation up. So I want to focus here on three themes, okay, within that overriding theme, and that is words, perceptions, and policy, okay? So with regard to words, I want to emphasize the idea that semantics really drives, to a great extent, reality. So how you present things, what words you use, and what words we have been using in the past related to streets have made a big difference and can make and have a lot of potential to shape the discussion and the opportunities. So just as the most relevant example is we're talking about opening up the streets versus closing off the streets, right? I think you'd all agree that the former is a more proactive, more positive, more politically palatable way of saying it. So we want to also think about what's the emerging narrative with regard to how it coincides with ideas of placemaking and planning at the human scale. And then I want to talk about this seismic shift that's occurring that is being laid out in the form of policy, primarily in California, with the whole transition from level of service to the focus on vehicle miles traveled. So level of service, I'm sure most of you have heard about it or have worked with it. That's been the gold, basically the gold standard for transportation planning. And that's here. That's let me see, where am I'm just having trouble with my here. I don't see the arrow, so it's just going wild here. Okay, so I'm trying to go back and it's going forward. So, well, I think I've kind of lost control of this, of my arrows here.
Would it be better, Sarah, if you just took it over and just move the
Do you
slide
mind, Sarah,
for Morty,
taking
or
it over and going back?
No, I don't mind.
Thanks.
Nope,
Okay,
I don't mind.
so let's we're not ready for this deer yet, but just okay. So we're here. Okay, we'll go to the next one, please. Okay, and then go on to the next, please. Okay, so so here, starting again in a little more detail with regard to the semantics. You know, we've all been talking about these things with regard to these different concepts, and whether you're in the planning realm or engineering or whatever, or working just in community planning and nonprofit groups. You know, you're familiar with livable cities, concepts, quality of life, things that are in the language that can be used to describe different aspects of street life and the things that we probably all like to see more of. But some of the things have been, you could say, under the radar. And Walk Bike Alliance is very keenly aware of the health connection. Okay, so the planning, sustainability, health connection with walking and biking and all those benefits that are derived therefrom, and quality of life. And what I think we all get back to as probably the paramount issue, and that's becoming more and more critical as there are more people injured, whether they're kids trying to get to school or adults trying to get just to commute or go out for a recreational ride, and that is safety. That in every single forum I have participated in all my work in the last few years, this is the number one thing, and I think you all agree on that. So the other thing that you know, I put in here, which we don't hear much about, is the idea of adventure and autonomy. And I think that we need to explore some of these other ideas too, because it's really a good dose of excitement when you get on your bike or you go outside, and for your senses, for your level of stress, there are all these different benefits that accrue. So these are words that we can use and introduce and think more about in a deeper level, so that we have this, we're thinking at it also from this emotional and psychological level, which is important because we want to share this with others when we talk about what we'd like to see out there. Okay, so next we'll look at this, we'll bring back the deer. Now, so you can look at this either, here's the question you can pose is, if you're in a car or there's a car passing, is this car driving through the forest? Or is this deer crossing the road? Okay? You know, it's just a different way of looking at it. This is perception, and how you ask the question. So does the deer, the next slide, please. There, now I see my arrows again. So yeah, does the deer cross the road or does the car cross the forest? So, you know, it may seem really simplistic, but think about when people come up with these statements about, you know, the little girl just ran out into the street, or biker appeared out of nowhere. Well, this is really their zone, in a sense, to be shared with, you know, with other uses. It's not supposed to be dominated by just the vehicle. So when and there's a tendency to blame the victim also if somebody gets hit, because it's generally from the perception of the person in the vehicle. The next, please. The next slide, please. Okay, so, and just real quickly, this is just a shot I took of a poster on the wall of a church in Mallorca, in this very small town that my daughter and I were biking through, trying to get back to where we were staying. And I just saw that sign, and it just caught my eye because of the different uses crossing through the crosswalk. And I think that was probably focused more on the capital city, the one major city, Palma, which actually is like a big city in a sense, is very intense, but very people oriented and bike oriented. So, okay, so the next please, next slide. So I just put on here because just expanding this context, you know, the streets are made for walking, biking, scooting, and lots of other things. And I have some shots. Next, please. Next slide, please. So this is in a little part of Bonn, which is a former capital of Germany. My wife, Iris, is from this little part of Bonn where they actually have their own dialect that many of the older people still speak, the Kessenich dialect. It's not that large of an area, but she used to live right around the corner. But anyway, you can see the scale here and how conducive it is when you have you know, narrow streets, and that naturally slow down traffic and the mixed use alongside those areas. And this is a very common sight with this person and their kids passing by. Next slide, please. Okay, and we can go through these just in I don't have to say too much. This is in Barcelona, where I was so impressed with the amount of space that's afforded to bikes and other non-motorized uses. And I think some of these bikes are, I can't tell from here, but I thought I saw a few e-bikes in there too. So motor, non-motors. Okay, so when we hear the word transportation, what do you think of? Okay, do you think of children riding skateboards or playing soccer, biking, walking, street fairs, farmers markets, festivals, block parties, romance? No, you don't think of romance when you hear the word transportation. Next slide, please. So more likely, you're going to think about this: roads, bridges, highways, infrastructure, basically, but heavy duty infrastructure. You're also going to be stressed out, maybe running late trying to get somewhere or get through traffic. The inversion layer, accidents, back pain. What about your chiropractor appointment? Car payments. Okay, next slide, please. So, because, and why is that? That's because the traditional paradigm is focused on speed and efficiency and travel time, getting from point A to point B as soon as possible. So why did I meant to say something else about oaks there. It looks a little strange, straight roads and oaks. Well, it just was a reminder to myself when I was working somewhere, and the public works director mentioned that they needed to straighten out that road that curves too much because people keep missing that turn. And in order to straighten it out, you have to level an entire grove of oaks, of mature oaks. And, you know, there's something there that's just not connecting properly, because I think it's turned on its head when you think that you have to remove a whole grove of oak trees so that people can make a turn instead of just slowing down, okay? Anyway, this kind of all leads to this traditional use of this the major metric that's used in the transportation profession, which is the level of service. It's the volume to capacity ratio along roadways. And oftentimes, going to the next slide, please. You know, it's all about speed, right? Okay. But what happens if you think about it? Even though this has been the prime directive, this is not what happens in the long run. When you design streets for speed, they usually get filled up, and everyone's driving at a snail's pace. So if you just take, for example, during rush hour, Shinden or State Street going into Boise, they're all backed up. So this is just the conundrum there. Now, what are we looking at instead? So we're calling it mobility nowadays, all right? And, you know, a lot of people who are in this know what generally mobility implies. It's kind of a paradigm shift, but there might be other words that could be used in conjunction with this. And, you know, I'd like all of you to think about those things. Maybe if it occurs to you, you have a good one for today or just down the road, because I think we need even more words that connect and resonate with public in general. But what we imply by mobility, I think it's more than what we've been talking about, for example, with the concept and planning of complete streets. Because complete street seems like it doesn't really tell you, well, how much of that street are you going to get if you're a pedestrian or a biker? It just means, you know, it's for a broader cross-section of users, but you can still be sidelined to the edge. So mobility, I think, takes into account a lot of broader sphere of activities and ideas. Okay, the next one, please. So what I think in a broader sense that we're also trying to achieve is a lot of these emerging priorities of cities as well, such as climate change, affordable housing, which is one of the top concerns right now, health, which we mentioned earlier, the idea of equity and accessibility within the overall population. And then these also have many benefits, as you're aware, to the local economies and through economic development. And how do we get to these points? We connect better land use and transportation, which has been so treated so individual. Okay, and we deal with the concepts of mixed use and transit-oriented development, redevelopment, adaptive and historic reuse projects, things of that nature. But all these kind of things are some of the main priorities of recent legislation that's enacted in California to address where they want. These things are not achieved through level of service. You know, that's a very narrow thing, and it just doesn't get you there. But you look at vehicle miles traveled, how you do that related to land use and connecting land use to transportation, you have more opportunities through which to achieve those kinds of ends. And in California, one of the main the main drivers there is greenhouse gas emissions, because they're trying to meet their targets. They have very strict state targets, and that need to be met, and that is usually that's achieved now through developing regional transportation plans that have sustainability goals as an integral part of those plans now, and it's called the sustainable the sustainability criteria, so the traditional level of services standard that runs counter to most of these goals that are trying to be achieved through these new approaches in the regional transportation plans. The other part of this, I should mention, is that they're the traditional LOS criteria are very costly for developers to achieve, because just, for example, take a look at the LIV district downtown. They're not looking at trying to maximize level of service by any means. They want to maximize human scale use and mobility. So they're not looking at if they were trying to maximize LOS through that area, they would not have provided wide sidewalks and tried to slow down traffic through there. So just based on LOS, that would have never been approved. And if they would have tried, I mean, they would have had to spend massive amounts for mitigation measures to actually speed up traffic. It's almost a little like parking, trying to provide so much parking that has oftentimes detrimental side effects. So just moving through this a little bit, I want to stay on track here. So basically, ditching the LOS standard in California, they started this off with integrating it into the CEQA guidelines, the state CEQA guidelines, which is California's environmental quality legislation. It's California Environmental Quality Act. If you're familiar at all with NEPA or the National Environmental Policy Act, this CEQA relates to any major projects with a potential significant impact on the environment, where you have to prepare environmental impact report, and lower level for less significant projects. Anyway, that's where that LOS standard always came in and wreaked havoc with trying to do any sustainable projects. So now that they've moved away from that, they can now better achieve some of these sustainability goals. Okay, and I just put some Boise examples of, you look at the difference between with some of these big streets that we have running through the area, and and you can look at, wow, they're great with level of service. 5 lanes, keep that traffic going. They do slow down on occasion, as I mentioned earlier, but what else do they provide as far as ability to uh, uh, for communication and et cetera along a street?
Hey, Morty, can I
Okay,
interrupt you for just a,
moving down from this.
Morty, can I interrupt you for a quick second?
Yes,
Morty,
am I
this,
going over time?
no, you're fine. And this is a really interesting presentation. I just thought that we should just pause for a moment. I think most people on this call probably know what LOS is and level of service, but I thought it would really be helpful if you or somebody could just describe what we're talking about when we talk about level of service, just in 3 sentences. Can you do that?
Okay, I'll try in 3 sentences. But then
Okay.
I want to invite, anybody else who's out there to also chime in, because you might have somebody that's a transportation engineer as well. But basically, they have a handbook that's used across the nation in transportation planning. It's mainly from an engineering standpoint, and they measure the amount of cars movements going through an intersection in a given amount of time, and that's converted into this volume to capacity ratio. Okay, and then if at a certain level, they have different levels. I think it's A, B, C, and D. And they might have F. I think it just goes to D. Someone else could chime in there. And if you're below, I believe, a C, then you have to do something about it if you have a proposed development project. But that's been the focus. So anyone else wants to jump in on that one?
Yeah, we've got some folks here from ITD and I think ACHD. If anybody would like to jump in and just talk a little bit about level of service, I think it could really help people understand transportation planning and how decisions are made to increase capacity, which is frequently widening roads. And we're talking about level of service for cars. There is also level of service for pedestrians. So, anybody want to talk about that?
I'll be happy to. The comment I'd like to make is that by and large, elected officials, city council members, county commissioners, and even highway district people don't really understand level of service, nor what it means in terms of their budget. And it takes folks who understand it, it's their responsibility to go and educate them on that and understand the direct consequences. The engineers aren't going to tell them that in their own agencies. So, for example, at that Boise City Council, Elaine could probably describe level of service and still be sound asleep. But the other council members, I'm not sure if they could. So it makes it difficult for them to then weigh in and say, we don't want the agency to prioritize level of service. And I'm guessing this is the case in NEPA and Idaho Falls, all over the place. The other is that in attempting to explain level of service, even if they understand car level of service for bicycling, pedestrian, and transit use is a bit different. And unless folks are willing to understand the difference, it's difficult to incorporate that, let alone get the agency to adopt metrics that balance level of service for cars. So for example, our agency does not. We only use level of service for cars. We do not have a countervailing measurement. So we could go in and build something and say, look, we're bringing this down from a projected level of service F to level of service D for cars. End of story. Even though what we may do in the process is take that same area from level of service B for pedestrians to level of service F for pedestrians. So we don't even have the tools to measure it. So educating the decision makers on how level of service actually operates in real life is something I think we as advocates have an obligation to do.
Cynthia,
I have a
I would just
question.
add to that. The level of service metrics for biking and walking are much newer, and they're still being developed, and so they're not as accepted across the industry. Whether that's a good thing, you know, is kind of up to the individual, but there is some good metrics out there that could be used better than we currently use them. And the one thing Jim left off, the real problem with level of service is the way we've applied it and used it historically, is it presumes that you don't want congestion, and that if your level of service is revealing when and where you have congestion, you presume you don't want it, then it drives you. Historically, it's driven us to widen roads, where some places we're now finally realizing that we can't widen our way out of congestion. And a better way, if we're going to use level of service, I think there are much better tools, and Morty's talked about vehicle miles traveled. We have some people moving that direction. Is for communities, even if you are using level of service, to say, we're willing to accept congestion. If we have level of service F during peak hours at certain intersections, that's just life. And that's what cars have to live with. That's also just a thinking and a different way to think about how we consider level of service.
Hey, this is Ryan, ITD. I'd weigh in. When I was in contracting service, I did a research and development program on road user cost, which used level of service. Basically, we fine contractors if they stay in the right of way doing construction for too long. And then we fine them by the amount that it costs the economy. And we do that based on level of service. And level of service is a ratio of volume to capacity. So volume is the speed and car type that is using a roadway for cars. And it's also for PEDs, bikes, scooters, ripsticks, Heelys, electric scooters, you name it. And then the capacity is typically pavement. Pavement equals capacity. If you have pavement that's small for like a 3-foot sidewalk, there's a capacity rating there, all the way up to a runway that's 90 feet wide that you can land 6 truss aircraft on. So all of those users have levels of service. It's balancing those and trying to look at the performance categories that I think is really important for this community to consider, such as what traffic calming does, what a hawk does, a roundabout versus a stop sign, which tends to pulse traffic, or you can use a stoplight, which will send a band phase through, and you can run that in single or split phase. And there's all sorts of different methods of managing users, but I agree with everything that the folks on this call have said, but LOS comes down to volume divided by capacity.
Gary Toth of Project for Public Spaces, who was an engineer with New Jersey Department of Transportation, has said that level of service was developed for freeways and was not intended when it was developed to be used for city streets. Sandpoint about 12, 14 years ago decided level of service D was just fine. The current administration, I think, doesn't like the term D, so they would like to change that, but a municipality can decide that it is willing to put up with a little congestion in order to not widen streets.
Thank you, Molly. And I didn't mean to hijack your presentation, Morty. I wanted to just pause for a second to just have that conversation and explanation for everybody. So
I did see that Harley had a hand raised.
Great.
And then lowered it. Did you have something you wanted to add, Harley?
Yeah, I appreciate the conversation, but I have kind of a higher level. Each agency and policy decision maker department has some type of direction defined by something I'm not aware of. So we're talking about public policy and the implementation of in this whole conversation. At what level and how do we find out how to make the change when an agency is already using a metrics that we don't agree with? When I say we, I'm talking about the public. If we're looking at changing the new normal, how do we change it, and at what level are these policy decisions being made?
We have two agencies on with us. We have ITD and ACHD. Would either of them like to comment about that?
This is Mark Wastall with District 3. I'm not an engineer, but I know a few of them. My understanding is that for the traffic side, they use what's called the AASHTO, American Association of State Highway Officials book, nicknamed the Green Book, and that has how you determine performance. And as engineers, they have to have guidance that they use and that they take into consideration if they put their professional stamp on a plan. Now, I know that there's NACTO, whatever, National Association of City Transportation Officials. I don't know the difference in terms of guidebooks that the two have. I know that on the design side, I know there's some differences. For the actual traffic side, I'm not sure. So that's the point there on why the engineers, they have to follow a accepted guidebook. One of the things, though, that they have is the books say to use the 30th highest volume hour of the year and to design off that. Now, if that changed from 30th to 200th or 300th, you would have a different capacity that you would be looking for, and your facilities would be a lot smaller because you wouldn't be able to justify that very high number you often get in the 30th hour example. If you have Highway 55 going up to McCall, your 30th hour is very high because you have the weekends in the summer. But if you took it down a few hundred spots, that would go away, those high numbers. So that's something to take into consideration. In terms of level of service, Florida DOT has something that we've used before, and they have QLOS, quality level of service. And that covers not just intersections, but also straightaways. They have level of service indicators for transit, pedestrian, and bicycles. For transit, it's really periodicity of service that they measure off of. And for bicycles and pedestrians, it's the quality of the facilities out there, whether you have you're on the highway, you're off, or on a road, you have a separated pathway off the road, etc. And those are not, I guess, number of user based like a vehicle level of services. And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I appreciate that.
Cynthia, Mark gave a great description of the engineering side of LOS, and it's a very valuable tool. It works well. It gives you really good data. I think to Harley's question, though, Molly really was the one who responded. It's not how we get the data, it's what we do with it. And it's the policymakers who decide what to do with the data. And so the answer, Harley, is it depends upon the road and whose jurisdiction it is. So depending on where you live, it might be your city. If it's an ITD road, it's ITD, most likely the district, at the district level rather than the state level, but it could be both. And here in Ada County, it's Ada County Highway District. So it's really influencing the policy and the policy makers for what they choose to do with that data. Because it's ultimately a policy decision to determine, City of Boise, like City of Sandpoint, has determined they're willing to tolerate a certain level of congestion during peak hour. And that's certainly within the purview of any group of policymakers to do.
Thanks, Deanna. And to tie it together, I think Jim Hansen brought up a really good point. It's about educating leaders. So understanding the tool and then making sure that the people who are making our laws understand how the decisions that they make impact the people who live in those areas. So great discussion. I'm going to Morty, I'm going to stop hijacking your presentation, and if you want to keep going, and if love it if you could maybe wrap up in about 5 minutes. Would that be adequate time?
Sure, sure.
Okay.
Sure, no problem. I just want to add that I think this was really great input, and I learned a little bit there too. And I wanted to just observe, though, that we're moving from a space where the divided policy, the divided conversation, the divisions, where we've had this working in the transportation realm and then working in the planning realm. And now it's moving some places more slowly, others a little more quickly, to bridge that gap and work together so that you can integrate some of these values, because you can't any longer just treat them separately. And you all realize that. And that's the main problem. All these manuals that have been alluded to, the traditional engineering manuals, that's how they've traditionally been used in general, you know. So that's a key issue. Anyway, I really appreciate, again, that input, and I'm going to have a lot of takeaways myself from that. So I just, if we could just move along a little faster with the slides, and this is just a quick slide here, the one you were just looking at. I was teaching there in France in the Bretagne area, and interestingly though, I didn't see that many bike riders there, and I was really amazed because at least when I was there, the weather was ideal, and I was on foot mostly. They have very good bus service. I was looking to borrow a bike while I was there during this weather, and it was just super conducive. So a lot of great things about this particular area of France, but it's so much related to culture, because if you had the same blueprint as this town, really low-key town, anywhere in the Netherlands and a lot of places in Germany, it would have been packed with bikers. Okay, so this is just the difference. And there are other areas of France that there's more of a bicycle culture. That's just my observation. It's not, you know, I through showing a lot of pictures in Europe where I've spent some time both bike touring as well as working, I didn't want to leave you with the impression that it was all, from my standpoint, nirvana, because it's not. There are a lot of places that just don't take advantage of what they have there, and then in other cases where it's an absolute nightmare, like say Athens, Greece, for example, and trying to get from Athens to the ferry terminal. It's not as bad as Guatemala City, but it's pretty bad. So, you know, there are differences between places there. Okay, so moving along from Britannia. Next slide, please. Okay, that's just a copy of the one right before that was the Regional Transportation Plan from San Luis Obispo, SLOCOG, San Luis Obispo Council of Governments, the Regional Transportation Planning entity there. Okay, so moving ahead, this is one of my favorite pictures that I couldn't leave out. I love those goggles on that dog. And this is in nearby where we were living in northern Germany for a while. Okay, next slide. Okay, and we can just pass through these slides. There's something about this picture that is kind of, I let you know that there are cars that line up, but in back of the bikes. So the bikes have priority. They can just, the limit line for the cars are ways back. And so the bikes go up and they're first. And what are they waiting for? They're waiting for not a cargo, a rail car train, but they're waiting for passenger trains to pass, and quite a few bikes. And this is in Bonn, Germany. Let's see. So the next, going forward, this is also in Bonn. Along this bike path goes on forever, all the way up to the headwaters in the. It actually runs. The river runs north, runs from south to north. A little bit strange, but it goes toward the North Sea, and the headwaters of the Rhine River, one of the biggest rivers in Europe, is the Bodensee up in Switzerland. Anyway, I better not give you a travel log here, but this is a really great example of it's a commuting, the one right before, with commuters, bike tourists, walkers, e-bikes, everything. You can see along the river there, that's the walking part, and this part here in the foreground, that's for the bikes and e-bikes, etc. Okay, the next one the next one here is Barcelona, and look how wide that basically it's like a parkway. And that's just not a plaza, but this goes on for, I think it's something like almost 20 miles. So this is very good for a variety of alternate transit modes. Okay, next one is coming up here. Next slide is we can go to the next one here. Okay, so this is really great. And that one was in, oops, skipped ahead too far. Right before this one, that slide was downtown in Bonn, Germany. And this is one of those accidental bike parking areas, you know, where you have this rail around the green area. And basically it accommodates probably about 1,000 bicycles because it's a very large, expansive area. And we find these around in all kinds of cities where the accidental designs have actually been better than the purposeful designs. Anyway, it's a great parking area for bikes. Next. Okay, so we're looking at, you know, trying to kind of wrap up now. We're looking at a lot of new challenges, but there are also great opportunities to, we're having these challenges with the shrinking curb space you've heard a lot about, with the delivery vehicles and Ubers, et cetera, and transit stops, but also this conflicts on the sidewalks and a lot of pedestrian areas and then with the emergence of some of the other types of micromobility. And then but you do have, on the other hand, a lot of shared goals, a lot of shared issues related to safety and sustainability. So there are a lot of opportunities for collaboration and partnerships. The next slide, please. So just as some parting thoughts, you know, the words drive perceptions, and they drive policy. And so this isn't really an acronym. I didn't have time to come up with an acronym in a hurry, but this is WDPDP. We're going to have to make some kind of acronym out of that, rearrange them into a word. Okay, so we have just leaving off the end here, coalition and partnership building, and also temporary measures. I'm really into temporary measures because we don't have time to watch anybody else, you know, get killed in the existing scenario, in the existing situation we're dealing with. We're experiencing an incredible time right now when you go out on your bike or you go for a walk and seeing what it really looks like. And that's a rare opportunity in a sense. So we don't want to give this up when we when we come out of this crisis. Okay. So the next, I'm just thanking you and for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And we'll just leave it there. If there are any questions about anything technical I dealt with that I didn't get into much detail about, or anything else, just feel free.